All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started now, and there might be a few more participants joining us in, but we'll get started anyways. So again, thank you for joining us. This panel is hosted by the British section of IFT, IFT being the Institute of Food Technologists. IFT is a nonprofit scientific society, which functions as a forum for both food professionals and students to collaborate and learn around all aspects of the science of food. The British section is one of the 53 regional groups of the IFT organization. So if you're interested in learning more about IFT or the British section, you can see the number of different sites on this slide to find more information. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat window. You can use that to communicate with other participants during this panel. Just next to that button is the Q&A button. And you can submit questions to the panelists using that button. The format of the panel will begin with 5 to 10 minutes for each panelist to provide an opening statement, with the remainder about 30 minutes being dedicated to answering the audience's questions. We will be recording today's webinar, and we will be sending out the recording after the event. So this panel today is going to focus on the food policy decisions and the science behind them, and how that relates to a potential trade deal between the US and the UK. So now that the UK has left the EU, there's a lot of opportunity to form potential trade deals with other countries such as the US. Now, clearly there are differences between the food standards, the food policies between different countries. But what's less clear is whether these policies have any impact on the actual safety of the product. That, however, hasn't stopped many news articles and things going around social media talking about concerns such as ethics, food processes, animal welfare, and lots of rumors circulating. There's been lots of buzzwords such as chlorinated chicken, artificial colors, hormones in meat, all causing a lot of fear in some consumers. But what's hardly made any of the headlines is the science. So today we're going to go beyond just those buzzwords and look at the science behind these regulations, all in the context of a potential trade deal between the US and the UK. Our first speaker on this topic is Kantha Shelke. Kantha teaches food safety regulations at Johns Hopkins University and is a principal at Corvus Blue LLC, a food science and research firm. She has a PhD and is a certified food scientist. She is also the chair of the IFT Food Law and Regulations Division. Today, Kantha will talk about flavors and colors and look at the roots of food regulation. Over to you.
Thank you, Kelsey, and hello, esteemed panel members. It's lovely to see you all. Let me quickly get to my presentation and share with you. And thank you again, Kelsey. As Kelsey aptly pointed out, the US-UK trade policies that are coming into place right now, the various trade deals, are pointing out the differences in food production practices and standards. The debate is stemming from the widely held concerns that the UK may be moving away from the European food regulations and aligning itself closer to the US to facilitate trade. And then the question then means, is the UK going to abandon those standards and regulations that are associated with safety and sometimes considered superior, that are associated with EFSA and Brussels, etc., on animal welfare, environmental protection, etc., and aligning itself with those set in Washington that some people in the world think may not be as safe. And the concern also is in the UK, will UK be lowering its food safety standards? Should any of you decide to leave now, this is all you need to know. The answer to this webinar is no, not at all. The regulatory standards and the framework in the UK and the US are very similar. They may appear different, but they are very similar. Food safety regulations in the UK and in the US are based on science, and neither one is safer than the other. Despite different regulatory frameworks, the overall approach is very similar, somewhat similar. It's based on well-established risk assessment procedures and risk management measures. Now, differences affecting trade can be found in the details. It's the nitty-gritty stuff that the devil is into, and the implementation of regulations. But when you compare the level of protection offered by the two frameworks, the criteria of good manufacturing practices, GMPs, and the various certification requirements, those actually are the key to aligning the rules and to negotiating mutual recognition agreements. So let's talk about that. But as a scientist, of course, I would put down Paracelsus' principle: dose makes the poison. So what you see here are the very common apple, pear, potato, and zucchini, which I think you call courgette in the UK. They all contain some compounds that are listed out here in very, very small amounts. So these are naturally occurring chemicals that are toxic to humans, but they're present in very small amounts, far below the harmful dose. And what is important is that just because a chemical is present, it does not mean that it is harmful in the amount present. What also follows is just because an ingredient or such a chemical is added to make a food or beverage does not always mean that that ingredient or chemical is behaving functionally or even physiologically. So even salt and water, without which we cannot live, if taken in the wrong quantities, can be harmful and even kill us. And that is the principle underlying food safety regulations of colors and flavors. And those are the two classes of compounds I'm going to discuss today in detail. And of course, when you're talking about food safety of flavors and colors, the conversation that always comes up is natural versus synthetic. Well, here in the US, the FDA has not clearly defined what is natural and what is synthetic. They've defined it in the case of colors and in the case also of flavors. But the human body does not know the difference between, say, let's look at it, phenylalanine that comes naturally occurring in a strawberry versus one that was synthetically added, say, to a chocolate and called it X-Lax because it's used as a dietary aid. So the human body cannot tell it whether the caffeine is synthetic or naturally extracted or in its natural situation in the human body. And this is another important concept that somehow the media has missed. We at IFT and food scientists at large have failed to explain this to the media. And as a result, stories that come out about chemicals in food are rather scary to people who have not had a formal education in the very fundamentals of biology, chemistry, and food science. In fact, I usually start my presentations by saying, I've never met a food which is not a chemical. Then the other part of it is that flavor and aroma compounds, they exist naturally in nature in a number of different formats. They could be in plants, they could be in animals, they could be derived from what was extracted from plants and animals, or they could be synthesized. They also exist in petroleum, crude oil, coal tar, etc. Coal tar is now not allowed in foods, but there are a number of aroma, flavor compounds and natural colors and colors that are actually extracted from petroleum, which, by the way, I'd like to point out, exists naturally in nature. So that question then is the regulations for safety versus interpretation for trade. Why the difference? Well, in the EU, if you take color, for example, food coloring regulations are based on EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency's risk-averse framework, which controls the use of color and also flavor additives to specify the conditions of use and to which foods they can be added, plus the maximum amount that can be added without risk to humans. In the UK, food coloring regulations and also aroma and flavor ingredients since 2013 have been following the EU regulations and are enforced by the food additives, flavorings, enzymes, and extract solvents regulations with parallel measures in each of the 4 nations, and they're very similar. In the US requires both flavors and color to be GRAS, generally recognized as safe, a designation that is given to that particular material on the basis of very strict toxicological safety studies that follows a definite framework. But it does not require labels on food products, such as that in the UK about artificial colors, to warn people about hyperactivity in children. But what is important is that both in the UK and in the US, only approved colors can be used in foods. The respective rules are embedded in different frameworks, but the US approach focuses on the safety of the product, while in the UK and in the EU, the focus is on the safety of the process. So the question then is food in one region safer than the other? Actually, no. So Statista did a survey of the world's top countries for food security based on the pillars of affordability, availability, safety, and quality. And it showed that the US ranked 3rd, but the UK was, well, Ireland ranked 2nd, but the UK was not too far behind, and it was very similar. So they are very similar in ranking, and I think the latest one actually showed them at par with each other. The Conference Board of Canada did a world ranking of food safety performance. Of course, Canada came first, but then Ireland, France, UK, and USA were very close on the heels of Canada based on food safety risk management, risk assessment, and risk communication. So what it really boils down to is that food safety regulations in the UK and in the US are steeped in science. But comparing the regulation and standards, however, is a tricky business because the UK, like the European Union, follows a different path from that in the US. Now, science evolves continually, and regulations are not always on par with the latest because regulations, by their very nature, are bureaucratic in nature and have to cross a lot of T's and dot a lot of I's before they go into effect. But they are based in science. So we are continually learning from what is happening in the marketplace, and this learning is applied into regulations. But when it comes down to food safety regulation, it's a pretty complicated matter. Understanding its scientific foundation and educating your audience is the key to garnering trust and lasting competitive advantage. So they are same, but somehow still different. But if we could explain that to our audience, I believe that our audience, the media, consumers at large, will understand that food in the US and in the UK, at least as far as coloring and flavoring is concerned, is pretty similar and safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kantha. You brought up some really excellent points and I think provided a really good framework for further discussion on some of the underlying differences. So next we will hear from Helen Munday. Helen is the Chief Scientific Officer at the FDF, where she's a leader in food safety and science policy. Previously, she was the Director of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at Coca-Cola. And before that, she spent 20 years at Mars Pet Care. She is currently the President of IFST. Today, Helen will speak about chlorine washed chicken and how it relates to different regulatory pathways. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you. I'm going to first of all try and share my screen. So let's see. Okay, you're seeing that okay, are you? Good, thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity to join you this afternoon. And thanks for the introduction, Kelsey. And I should first of all, of course, say that you didn't hear much about chickens in my CV. So I won't claim to be the world's expert on this topic, but we know that this is one of the topics that when people talk about US and UK trade arrangements that this one does often come up. So yeah, it's the case of the chlorine washed chicken, and I will try and just put a few of the facts out there on this topic. So I should probably just say first of all that probably amongst the speakers I'm somewhat unique in that I have a role as a representative of industry rather than being from an academic or a more neutral background, if you might say. But we are very proud at FDF to support this sector, and we have a very important theme, as you can see, around food safety and science. We also have a theme on post-EU exit trade. So yes, we now have this opportunity as the UK that we didn't have before to have some new trade agreements, and food safety and science and post-EU exit trade do interact. These are just some of our members. We have many, and of course many of them are multinational companies, and many of them would really like to move products in a very seamless way between the US and the UK. So of interest to many of our members and non-members alike. And just some numbers. So we are a very big sector in food and drink. So when you're talking about trade, you'll often hear people talking about cars or aerospace or engineering, but actually food is a really big part of the UK economy. Of course, food is not quite the same as aerospace, because aircraft engines don't have a use by date or a sell by date, which our products do. So there is a perishability element here. So you can't just, I think everyone knows me, one of my favourite products is pork pies. You can't just send a pork pie to halfway around the world and expect it to still be great on arrival. So historically, our main places to export to have been close to us, i.e. the EU, but there are clearly some things that will travel extremely well. So this US dynamic or situation is something that's very interesting to us. And given that we export a huge amount of money's worth of products, this is something that as the UK we are keen to do more of, but also we are nowhere near self-sufficient in food, and we import a lot of products as well. So I suppose we should really get down to basics on this one. What is chlorine washed chicken? Well, when you're producing chicken, bacteria can become attached to the skin or the flesh of the chicken. It can come from either the environment where they've grown up or where they are processed. And I think many of you will be aware that Campylobacter species are particularly problematic when it comes to poultry. And Campylobacter can be found on both US and UK chickens at point of sale, but of course they're found in other countries as well. So this can be, it is a food poisoning bacteria, and you obviously want to prevent it coming into the food, into people's houses and causing food poisoning as much as possible. So you need to find ways, and we just heard about good manufacturing practices where you can minimize the occurrence of that happening. And in the US, it is totally within the regulations to be able to rinse the finished processed product with a dilute solution of chlorine, which has efficacy in reducing the levels of bacteria and removing bacteria. However, in the EU, which the UK was part of until quite recently, the European Food Safety Authority that does the risk assessment has said that there are no safety concerns about exposure to chlorine from poultry carcasses. And indeed, chlorine is used for other applications. So you might wonder why chlorine washed chicken isn't something that we have in the EU and the UK. But the EU has taken a position where they say that relying on a chlorine rinse at the end of the production process could be a way of compensating for poorer processes earlier on in the production chain, whereby it could be poor welfare of the chickens, where they're potentially too close together, they don't have enough space, they become contaminated, or it could be in the abattoirs. And therefore, rather than cleaning things up at the end, what they want to do is set welfare standards and other standards that ensure that that contamination doesn't happen in the first place. Now, I will say that the UK position outside of the EU is not clear on this point at this moment. So we have been bound by the EU. 95% of our regulations have come from the EU. We now have the opportunity to do things differently, but the regulators in the UK have not said what their position is on this topic. This is a very good document I have found on this topic. If you want to find out more, I would recommend you take a look at this. I think, as I have just illustrated, you can see the regulation of chicken production does differ, and a bit like we just heard, you know, these sometimes are not very big differences, but in this chicken example, there is quite a different approach that's taken. And I've described that the UK EU is more a prerequisite approach. So you put things in early in the process to avoid something happening. Whereas in the US, it's more of a retrospective approach. The two endpoints are the same. You're after safe food, but the pathway that you take there to get there is different. And you could say that there are some philosophical elements such as welfare involved in that. And just to illustrate this, in the UK, if you look at the EU regulations, there are very clear regulations around welfare of poultry, whereas in the US, there isn't federal regulation that specifically applies to poultry, although there are animal welfare guidelines that many producers will comply with. And I wanted just to add that regulation is really the basics on this. And there are an awful lot of standards, voluntary standards in most cases, but things that are important to consumers where producers can go above and beyond the regulations. And these are some of the food standard type marks that you are probably familiar with, like Red Tractor, which say, you know, not only have we done what the regulations say, but we have gone over and above. So regulations are really just part of it. We know regulations are important in trade deals, and for that reason, the UK government has set up the Trade and Agriculture Commission. That is going to be reporting quite soon now, and they will be looking at how standards can be considered as part of setting up trade deals. And I wanted to show this particular graph because this might surprise you. You might have the view that there is no US chicken that comes to the UK, but actually there is. It's not a huge amount. In fact, it's really quite a small amount, but at this time, you can legally bring chicken from the US to the UK as long as your product complies with all of the UK's requirements. So it is possible now, and I'm sure it is also possible in the future. So in summary, whilst chlorine washed chicken has probably become the poster child of differences between the UK and the US, the endpoints are certainly the same, which is that you're looking to create safe food. And whilst differences do exist, they might illustrate that mutual recognition might be quite tricky between the US and the UK. And although Kantha said that there are a lot of similarities, they're not as, the UK is not as similar as it might be to some other countries like Australia and New Zealand, where we have more commonality as a starting point. But mutual recognition could be something that we can look at. And we know that the UK is certainly taking a position on the trade deals where they don't want to weaken the protection of food safety, but also of environmental protection. We know they've appointed a trade commission, so this is important, and they will be doing a report. And the US is not the only trade deal where these things will come up. There will be other tricky conversations to have on numerous topics, I'm sure, as part of these. And food is often seen as quite a pinch point on these things. However, I will conclude that science and evidence should always be at the heart of resolving any issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. Really interesting talk. And I think you did a really good job explaining some of the differences in the systems and how it relates to this example that, as you said, is all over the media and has become sort of a key point for these communications. So if you have any questions for Helen, you can ask them now in the Q&A button. And we will wait till all panelists have spoken before we begin with asking questions. Next, we'll hear from Jack Bobo. Jack is the CEO of Futurity, a food foresight company. He has both a scientific and a law background with a JD and an MS from Indiana University. He has worked as a senior advisor for global food policy at the US Department of State, and in 2015 was recognized by Scientific American as one of the 100 most influential people in biotechnology. Today, Jack will discuss hormones and pesticides usage and how that relates to a risk versus hazard analysis approach. Thank you for joining us, Jack.
Great, thanks for having me, and just getting started here. So really happy to be picking up where the other speakers left off. In many ways, I think they have said many of the important things that need to be discussed in this topic. And so I'm actually going to go through relatively quickly three really big topics: pesticides, hormones, and bringing in the precautionary principle, because I think that helps us to understand a little bit of the difference between regulation in the two regions. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail about the regulatory process. I think that some of that process has been described in the other two presentations, but I do want to talk a little bit just overall. The European Food Safety Authority, of course, has responsibility for doing the risk assessments, both for the product for its use, as well as establishing MRLs or maximum residue levels for the food. I've got in here some of the regulations that people can reference later on if they're interested. But the main thing is that, of course, the EFSA and now, of course, the UK are looking at both the safety for plants, animals, and people. And if we're looking at the US approach, the regulatory agencies that are involved are the Food Drug FDA, the Food Drug Administration, and the European and the Environmental Protection Agency. The legislation is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And so the US government and the regulatory agencies are also looking at very similar things. They're looking at plant, animal, and human health when establishing both the safety for use of a product as well as the MRLs or residue levels that are allowed on food. Now, one of the differences I think that's worth noting between the US and the European approach is that in the US approach, there's also this concept of a cost-benefit analysis. So it's not just looking at setting a specific risk level, but it's also looking at the implications in terms of the cost of regulating or not regulating a product that doesn't really have an exact comparator in the European or the UK system at the moment. In the United States, pesticides are reviewed every 15 years. In Europe and UK, it's 15 years or less. So there may be a more common review of products in both places. However, both regulatory authorities allow products to be re-reviewed if food safety considerations arise and there's a need to do that. So again, similar in application. So we have talked a little bit about risk assessments in the previous conversation, but I think it's sort of worth just laying out clearly what do we mean when we talk about a risk assessment. And the elements of a risk assessment are probably quite familiar to most of you. It's identifying what the hazards are, characterizing it, looking at exposure assessments, and then finally the risk characterization. Now, those are common approaches for regulatory systems around the world. So how regulators approach these issues is very similar wherever you go. However, there's been a tendency within Europe to focus more on hazard and less on risk. And I'll get into that a little bit as well in the next section, which is talking about hormones in meat production. Again, many of you are familiar with it. Growth promoting hormones have been used in the United States for a long time. These compounds can occur naturally in animals' body, and they mimic the hormones that are used mimic the naturally occurring compounds. Producers are using them because the animals will grow larger more quickly, they will use less animal feed, and they have a leaner product. So the products are being used because ultimately they provide a return on the investment for the producer, and they can add as much as $125 per animal in production. Growth promoting hormones have been used since the 1950s in countries around the world. 2/3 of the cattle in the United States and about 90% that are finished in feedlots, they use hormones. There are two general approaches. They can be implanted or they can be used as a feed amendment. And in both cases, again, it's about weight gain and feed efficiency are the reasons that they're using. So it's an economic approach. So the issue between the United States and Europe has been ongoing for quite some time. Europe announced its first bans in the early 1980s and implemented those in 1989. So this is not a new problem. This is a longstanding difference in opinion about how these products should be regulated. This has led to a couple of World Trade Organization cases between the US and Europe. And each time the approach that Europe has taken has been not found to have a strong risk assessment component behind it. And so these differences reflect more of the philosophical approach that Helen was talking about earlier, as opposed to a scientific consensus that these products are not safe. In fact, when you look at international assessments of these compounds, what you find is that the World Health Organization and the Food Agriculture Organization, and when they come together under the Codex Alimentarius Commission, 170 countries have determined that these products are safe if used appropriately. So there's generally a consensus as to the safety. The question comes as to more about the philosophical approach of using growth promoting hormones, which gets into questions of animal welfare and the health of the animals. So finally, the status, as I mentioned, the ban started in the 1980s. There were WTO proceedings. The most recent proceedings ended with a recommendation that the European Union and the US come to an agreement. The two regions were able to sign a memorandum of understanding back in 2009. And currently there is some beef production that's sold into Europe. And that's from products that were not produced with growth promoting hormones. That's the current status. And it's worth remembering that before the ban in Europe, these hormones were used in the UK in some of the interventions with the European Food Safety Agency and the European Union by the UK in support of allowing these products as being safe. So the UK actually has a history of recommending these products as being safe to use. So that might indicate that there's a possibility of a change going forward. Finally, some of the differences between the US and the European approach, and that may figure into the conversations around the UK, relate to the precautionary principle, which of course is part of the European Constitution. And simply, it's a strategy for approaching issues of potential harm where extensive scientific knowledge is lacking. And so there may be action that would be taken. The precautionary principle in the UK or in the European Union, of course, has as its origin the Agenda 21 of the Rio Declaration. I'm going to skip through here for a second. And there are some important differences, though, between the precautionary principle as laid out in Europe and the precautionary approach as laid out in the Rio Declaration, because and this is the earliest incarnation of the precautionary principle, it's not just that there are threats of harm that may be irreversible, and there's a lack of scientific evidence. But in its original incarnation, there was also this issue of looking at cost-effective measures in order to avoid any damage. And I think that in many ways goes to the US approach in regulation, which we refer to as the precautionary approach, or the FDA does, which is that that's really part of the risk assessment procedure, is looking not just at what could happen, the possibilities, but also the implications. Because when you choose not to regulate something, you're also making a determination that has an impact. So before I quit, I just want to briefly point out two topics that might come up in our conversation this afternoon. One is the regulation of neonicotinoids or neonics, and the other is glyphosate, which is commonly known as Roundup. As many are probably aware, neonics have been banned in Europe, though they are sometimes used under derogations that allow use of the products. Glyphosate, which is a herbicide, is allowed in Europe, but I think that it's important when in the context of a trade deal, in many ways, these are less important than they probably seem in the public conversation, because neither of these products are about food safety. They're really about their application. Neonics in terms of environmental impact, and we can talk about the science behind the current ban. And glyphosate, if to the extent that there is a concern over a hazard from exposure, it's really for people that are using this as part of their daily work. So it's not about glyphosate in food, and so it wouldn't actually impact trade. So things that seem like they could be really important and could cause challenges in terms of trade might not have any impact at all when we look at the reasons behind those concerns. And again, happy to talk a little bit more about the science behind it, the current considerations, and how we got here with neonics and glyphosate, but I'll leave that for the conversation to follow. So thank you very much. Look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Jack. Really good understanding and providing us some of the history and the background to really understand what's going on today. So thank you for that. And I'd now like to thank all of our panelists. I think you've all brought up some really good points that's going to make an exciting discussion. So with that, I'd like to remind you, if you do have any questions for any of the panelists, if you can enter that in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to transition over to the Q&A portion. My colleague, Grace McNally, will be hosting this portion of the event. She's a food technologist at Pippin Nut, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kelsey, and to our panelists for talking us through your chosen topics. As you can imagine, there's a lot of questions I have, a very exciting introduction. So I'm going to direct the questions to the panelists, but feel free to jump in and start a discussion. So let's start with a question for Kantha. So consumer confidence on food safety can easily be shaken. Do you think it would be helpful if customers realize the similarities in these regulations rather than the differences? And how can that be communicated? I think you're on mute.
Absolutely, Grace. What you say is very important. Confidence comes from knowledge and understanding. Schools today no longer provide home science, the fundamentals of food science, in the basic education curricula. So as a result, what people learn about food today or about food safety is what they hear from garrulous food activists and influencers who often don't have a lick of food science education or even an understanding of physiology or toxicology, or even understand the fundamentals of how food is made and why certain ingredients are added and why certain things are done. So fundamental education would help people understand from the very start why food products are made with the type of processes or the type of ingredients, and they would then focus on the similarities and what matters most than on differences and then result in irrational hysteria. So I think it's really education, and I think it's a great platform for IFD and food scientists at large to help educate their constituencies about regulation and about food science in general.
Thank you, Kantha. And Helen, When it comes to measures such as chlorine rinsing in chicken, it often seems that the perception is more from the public is more about the perception of the risk than the actual risk. How do we help consumers understand the difference between hazard and the risk?
Yeah, hazard and risk are always a difficult concept for people to grasp, and I think we all at times probably don't get the balance of this quite right. And so, as an example, and it's a non-food related example, after the dreadful events of 9/11 a decade or so ago, the UK had the tube trains were bombed and many people died. It was awful. So for some time afterwards, people didn't want to use the tubes, so they took to their bicycles. Now, being on a tube with lots of other people is probably quite hazardous, but the risk actually isn't very high, because the likelihood of an occurrence happening, something bad happening, is actually quite small, even if something really bad has happened recently, and therefore the your awareness of it is much higher. Whereas I can assure you, as a bicycle rider in London, it's actually quite a risky thing to do. And apparently the occurrence of people being injured as a result of riding bikes did go up quite substantially afterwards. So we have an idea in our head that something is risky, but we don't really recognise that it's about the controls that you do to manage that risk that make it a risk rather than a hazard, which is a much more theoretical thing and highly unlikely to occur. So, I mean, it's a concept that in all walks of life we would do much better to understand. And I think it's something that whether it's our food regulators or, I mean, this is actually a brilliant time to try and help people understand these things more around vaccines, for example. So, you know, the understanding of science and what is a hazard and what is a risk would help us on a number of these topics that we have talked about. The point that was made about, you know, the poison, and it's about the levels, and you know, water is a poison if you drink 7 litres of it, or some equally ridiculous amount, but it could kill you. And that natural doesn't mean good and synthetic doesn't mean bad, because we all know there's plenty of natural things that also it would be highly risky to consume them in large amounts. So, you know, there's an awful lot in this whole discussion. And I think on something like chlorine washed chicken, for example, I mean, the perception, I think, is that this is actually about food safety. This is not a food safety argument. And actually the Campylobacter, if you get a really nasty dose of food poisoning from that, could actually make you very, very sick. And the chlorine, which is used very safely in drinking water and, you know, to cleanse lots of different things, babies' bottles, etc., things that are very, very precious to us. We just need to really understand the issue. And of course, it's not always in everyone's interest to tell a straight story on these things. And I think, you know, you have to be really clear who you are going to listen to as your expert on these things.
Yeah, thank you for that, Helen.
If you don't mind, I'd like to add a couple of points on that. Great comments. First is, I think that it would help for food scientists to spend some time talking to cognitive scientists, because I think there's a lot that we can learn about things like the availability heuristic that are impacting, you know, the comments about natural. We all think happy thoughts when we hear the word natural. You know, the idea that, you know, if something can cause cancer, it's very hard for us not to believe that it does cause cancer. And so, we're all hardwired to understand hazards, and we're just not hardwired to understand risk unless we're statisticians and nobody talks to them. The one thing I learned after 13 years at the State Department was I had been talking about hazard, exposure, and risk for most of that time. And I eventually realized I should be talking about hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk. And it's really that perception of risk that most of us need to be talking about most of the time.
Thank you. So a question for you, Jack. I guess the mention of hormones and pesticides and herbicides, as you mentioned, glyphosate, often make consumers fearful because of the perception that they are harmful, as you said, for health and environment if used not in the correct way. What is the science behind their use, and can you share your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, there is a lot of science in terms of the risk assessment, and the types of the methodologies are well understood. And there are global international regulatory bodies whose only job is to establish what those residue levels should be. And so there's wide understanding of how to approach the questions, and there's relative consistency in the outcomes, whether we're talking about something like neonicotinoids or glyphosate. It often comes down to the perception issue. When we talk about glyphosate, much of the controversy that has arisen relates to the International Center on Cancer Research, or the International Agency for Cancer Research, and that outcome was a hazard-based decision. They said that it can cause cancer. So glyphosate is in the same hazard category as I think drinking coffee, it's below sunlight and above coffee. And so it's the same hazard as working the night shift. And so, that's useful information for regulators, but you still have to complete the risk assessment, which is to look at exposure. And with something like glyphosate, every regulatory agency in the world has actually come to the same outcome. So it's not that what IARC did was wrong. They did their job. They determined, could something cause cancer? But it's up to regulators to determine if it does cause cancer. And that's just very difficult for the public sometimes. And that's where media has a really important role in all of this, because while they may feel like they're just relating the news, the conversation about something that's not an actual risk undermines consumer confidence in our entire food system. And so many of these conversations around trade deals and focusing on differences is making people less confident in the food they eat, when our food has never been safer. And we need to be doing more to make people appreciate where we are and identify the gaps, because there are clear gaps that must be addressed, but the trend is in the right direction.
Thank you. So a question from one of our attendees for Kantha. Would you like to comment on the difference between conveying information to the public as opposed to the challenge of achieving more critical thinking around the information that's already available?
That's an excellent question. And I should point out what one of the members of the audience has also entered into the chat box. It says, while science may state that certain food products or food product methods are safe, the consumer's preferences and choices they wish to make need to be respected by the food industry. What it really comes down to is understanding. If the science is a difficult and a complex subject to understand, and if it is not taught the proper way, which involves critical thinking and analyzing, and as Jack has mentioned, looking at the risk and weighing it against, pragmatically against your circumstances. It's one thing to be working in glyphosate, the other one to being exposed to some glyphosate on your food. All of that matters. That only comes from proper education and being able to understand what matters most for our safety, and against the backdrop of our situation, our age, our lifestyle, where we are living, and what we do. If we give all of that, I believe that most people will come out with a very rational thought that is not colored by fear and hysteria. And that then changes, for example, that bar for what is preferred and what is allowed in the food industry. So it's because we don't understand that, and because the food industry, regulators, etc., have not taken that additional step to put that in place, what people jump to is conclusions based on fear, and irrational fear comes from lack of knowledge and understanding, and of course, lack of transparency from the food industry. So we are all in this together, and communication and education go hand in hand. And that is what will change, because how we made food a few centuries ago versus today is changing tremendously and will continue to change based on our environment. We cannot eat like we used to, and probably should not eat like we used to. Thank you.
Thank you, Kantha. A question for Jack from Brandon. Is there also an element of protectionism in the UK regulations? So blocking US meat and produce based on limits on hormones and residues could be a boost to UK producers by eliminating competition.
Well, it's not just a UK issue. I mean, every country has a tendency to be a little bit more careful for things that, you know, maybe they don't want to receive, and a little less careful. As the WTO reduced trade barriers, in many ways, the only trade barrier that was left to countries was to use food safety in sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So it's not really surprising that that has happened from time to time. And so it's really important that government officials are able to articulate a reason why people should want the trade deals. And that includes, you know, the livestock industry, poultry industry, other industries. And I think it's about opportunity. And large companies in the US and the UK already have access to each other's markets. The ones who don't are really the small and medium-sized enterprises. And by reducing trade barriers, it makes it easier for smaller businesses to access the markets. You know, if you look at the fastest growing parts of the US economy in terms of food, you know, it's local, artisanal, organic, regenerative. You know, those are all areas where the UK producer should feel like they have an incredible opportunity. The UK brand is extremely strong in the United States. And so rather than being concerned about market access, I think they should see access to the largest, you know, market in the world as an opportunity.
Thank you. And I think we may have time for one more question. So Helen, I'll direct this to you, but obviously Jack and Kantha, feel free. So UK consumers are rightly concerned about animal welfare and the environment. Do you think there's a pathway to take such factors into account consistently, and who would oversee the evaluation of such factors? I'm imagining that question is for the UK.
Yeah, and someone also asked about the Commission as well. And I think, you know, food plays a very special part in all of our lives. And in some ways, you know, food safety is the basic that we expect of it. We shouldn't be injured by it, made ill by it. But increasingly, we want our lives to be enriched by it, whether that's from nutritional routes. You know, it contains things that are very good for you and will help extend your healthy life, or it might be that we feel that we are encouraging welfare standards and environmental standards that will have a greater good beyond ourselves. And I think we see that people are very motivated towards environmental issues more than they probably ever have been. And so those kind of voluntary marks that I showed in my presentation are ones that people are increasingly moving towards. And Jack's right, you know, things like organic have become popular, and actually during the lockdown in the UK, organic products have done very well because we've got a bit more time to think about these things. We've maybe got a bit more money to spend on food because we can't do anything else. And we need to find a way, I think, of integrating these other things that are important to us as society, as well as food safety. Now, you can say perhaps these are very first world problems, because other countries, you know, if they can just have enough food and it's safe, that's probably good enough. But we know that our food chain is a long one. It's very international, and I think the more that we can do to try and incorporate environmental factors, which includes welfare of animals, etc., the more we should do that. And it's almost like a balanced scorecard of things, of aspects. I think you want food safety, absolutely, but can you have environment, welfare, and other things as well? If we can do that, we should, absolutely.
I could add just a little bit and say food science and food has become a very sexy topic, particularly during the pandemic. Everybody has taken to cooking, etc. And while there's a lot being said about how to cook, we haven't focused on the why we do certain things. Why is one thing better than the other, etc. If we did that, I have a belief that even food regulation will become a sexy topic.
And I would just add that government regulation is a floor, not a ceiling when it comes to food safety. And that there are many opportunities for consumers who have a higher concern about food to choose different products. And that's very important. You know, in the United States, before COVID hit, 40% of Americans didn't have the money they wanted to buy the food they needed at some point during the year. So, you know, the cost of food remains a significant issue for many. And so I think we need to keep in mind the importance of a diversity of choice in our food system, as long as it's all meets a certain safety standard.
Thank you so much to each of our panelists. We've run out of time, but I just wanted to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists, Kantha Shelke, Helen Munday, and Jack Bobo. We can't thank you enough for your time and your knowledge and your contributions today. I hope that everyone else has thoroughly enjoyed today's panel discussion. I'd like to thank the British section IFT for allowing us to host this, and of course, co-host Kelsey. We will follow up with a link to this recording. So from all of us at the British section IFT, thank you so much for joining, and have a lovely rest of your day.